Welcome back to the deep dive. We are really glad you're here today because we are unpacking a moment in history that, well, it feels incredibly relevant even right now.
Oh, absolutely. It is a massive shift.
Yeah, even though the ink on our sources dried about 500 years ago, we are looking at the moment Europe stopped being this chaotic mess of local fiefdoms and started looking like,
Like actual countries,
right, like modern countries.
which is something we totally take for granted today. You know, the idea that there's a central government, a single army, one set of laws.
Sure.
But if you look at the source materials and the historical records from, say, the late 1400s, none of that existed.
Yeah.
Not in the way we think of it anyway.
It was basically the Game of Thrones map, right? Just hundreds of little colors and banners clashing all the time.
Potentially, yeah. We
Yeah.
call it feudalism, but really it was just organized fragmentation.
Right.
If you were a king in 1450, you were basically just a landlord with a slightly better title. You had to negotiate for absolutely everything.
So the crown was really just a fancy hat. It wasn't a command center.
That is the perfect way to put it. You were often just the first among equals. You want to go to war, you have to ask your dukes to lend you their soldiers.
And if you want money, you have to go begging the church or the nobles for a loan.
Exactly. So our mission for this deep dive is to look at the historical records and trace the rise of what historians call the new monarchs.
The heavyweights.
Right. We are unpacking the playbook used by figures like Henry VIII, Elizabeth I Ferdinand, and Isabella. How did they take that fragmented mess and forge the modern sovereign state?
And looking at the research here, this wasn't just about winning battles or marrying the right cousin.
No, not at all.
It was basically a hostile takeover of society. They had to seize control of three specific pillars: God, money, and the law.
That is the exact structure of what happened. And that first battleground was arguably the most volatile of them all: religion.
Which brings us to the Reformation. But, and this is a key distinction, in this context, we aren't really looking at the theology, are we? We are looking at religion as a tool of management.
Right. From the perspective of a new monarch, the Catholic Church was a massive administrative problem.
It was a rival.
Exactly. It was effectively a state within a state. The Pope was a foreign power who owned huge tracts of land right in the middle of your country. He collected taxes from your people and commanded their ultimate spiritual loyalty.
And if you were trying to consolidate absolute power, you really can't have your subjects listening to a guy in Rome before they listen to you.
You have to break that link. And the most famous example of this is Henry VIII in England.
Right. Everyone knows the story about the 6 wives.
Yeah, the wives get all the attention, but the real story, the political story in our sources, is the Act of Supremacy in 1534.
That is the moment he declares himself the supreme head of the Church of England.
It was a total seizure of sovereignty. By doing that, he didn't just get his divorce. He completely cut off the financial flow to Rome.
He seized the monastery lands, too.
Which was a massive transfer of real estate and wealth directly to the crown.
Huh.
And at the same time, he made loyalty to the Pope treason.
Right, the Treason Act.
Yes, refusing to recognize the king's spiritual authority literally became a capital offense. It was a brutal, physical way to unify the chain of command.
God speaks to the king and the king speaks to you.
Exactly.
But Henry was a bit of a sledgehammer. His daughter, Elizabeth I, she seems to have been a bit more, well, subtle.
Much more subtle. She comes in after decades of religious bloodshed. And her solution, as outlined in the Act of Uniformity in 1559, was brilliant pragmatism.
She basically said, I don't care what you believe in your heart, but on Sunday, you will show up to the Anglican Church.
Right. It is the 16th century version of don't ask, don't tell.
Yeah.
She famously said she had no desire to make windows into men's souls. She just wanted external compliance.
So she used religion as a stabilizer, like a glue to hold the state together rather than a weapon to purge everyone.
Provided they didn't openly rebel, yes. She balanced the Catholic and Protestant factions to maintain order.
Now contrast that with Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella, they definitely did not have a light touch.
No, they went the complete opposite direction. They used the Spanish Inquisition starting in 1478.
Which we usually associate with torture and fear.
Which is entirely accurate. But from a purely state-building perspective, the Inquisition was a tool of unification. Spain at the time was this messy collection of different kingdoms and cultures.
So they used strict Catholic orthodoxy to forge a single Spanish identity.
Yes. To be Spanish was to be Catholic. If you were Jewish or Muslim or a dissenter, you were removed.
It effectively weaponized faith to create a unified national identity.
It solidified their power, but at a horrific human cost. It was purification as a government policy.
Then you have France. They always seem to do things a bit differently. Francis I, he didn't break with the Pope like Henry did, and he didn't launch an inquisition like Isabella.
He was a negotiator. He signed the Concordat of Bologna in 1516.
What was the specific deal there?
He basically went to the Pope and said, look, I will stay Catholic and I will recognize your ultimate spiritual authority, but I get to appoint all the bishops and abbots in France.
Ah, so he gets the patronage, he gets the jobs.
Exactly. He turned the church hierarchy into a staffing agency for the French crown. He secured all the political and financial benefits of controlling the church without the headache of a massive religious schism.
That is incredibly savvy. You keep the fancy title and I will take the hiring power.
It was a very effective compromise.
But what I find really fascinating in the sources is what happens when these monarchs cannot control the religion, like in the Holy Roman Empire.
That is a great point to bring up. Sometimes the new monarch strategy just hit a brick wall. In the Holy Roman Empire, you had the Peace of Augsburg in 1555.
That is the famous principle whose realm his religion.
Yes, which basically is the central emperor admitting that he cannot enforce one single faith across the board.
It decentralized religious power back to the local princes.
Right. If the local prince is Lutheran, the state is Lutheran. It linked religion directly to political sovereignty, but on a local level rather than a national one.
And France eventually had to do something similar with the Edict of Nantes in 1598 to stop their own civil wars, right?
They did. Henry IV granted limited tolerance to the Huguenots, the French Protestants. But notice the power dynamic there. The king is the one granting the right.
So it still proved that the crown was superior to the church.
Exactly. Because the crown could dictate where and when the church operated. It was about stabilizing a fractured state.
So whether they are breaking with Rome, negotiating with it, or suppressing it, the ultimate goal is always the exact same. The state must be the ultimate authority.
Correct. But asserting authority on paper is one thing. Actually enforcing it is another. You can't run a country just by shouting orders from a throne room. You need a machine to execute those orders.
Which leads us perfectly to the second pillar of the new monarch's bureaucracy. And looking at the notes for this section, it really feels like watching the birth of the modern government.
It really is.
They realized that relying on the old nobility, the guys with the castles and the ancestral swords, was a massive trap.
It was a dangerous trap. The old nobility felt entitled to power. They had their own power bases, their own armies, and a lineage that often went back just as far as the kings did.
They were rivals.
Exactly. So the monarchs built a bypass. They started hiring from the middle class.
In France, they called them the nobles of the robe.
I always love that term. The robe refers to the academic robes of lawyers and clerks. These were educated commoners or minor gentry.
And their entire career depended completely on the king.
That is the genius of it. It is the difference between a hereditary warlord and a civil servant. If a duke gets mad at the king, he goes back to his castle and raises a rebellion.
But if a bureaucrat gets mad at the king,
he gets fired and loses absolutely everything.
So the king essentially surrounds himself with people who are legally and financially obligated to be loyal to him alone.
And then they use these loyal administrators to enforce a new kind of centralized law.
Take England's Star Chamber, for example, which honestly sounds a bit sinister, like a villain's lair.
It definitely became sinister later on, but originally it was a very necessary legal innovation. In the old feudal system, if a powerful duke was terrorizing his local village, the local courts couldn't touch him.
Because he owned the court. He was the judge and the jury.
Right. So the Star Chamber was a royal court that operated entirely outside the traditional common law.
It was like the federal government coming in to overrule the corrupt local sheriff.
That is a brilliant analogy. It could haul in the most powerful nobles in the country and punish them directly. It sent a very clear message to everyone. The king's justice is everywhere and no one is above the crown.
It was a way to break the legal immunity of the rich and powerful.
Exactly. A completely centralized legal power in London.
But building this huge machine, the courts, the bureaucrats, the professional armies, that is incredibly expensive. Feudal levies were essentially free, but professional armies demand actual gold.
And that brings us to the money. The old feudal system was land-rich but cash-poor. The new monarchs needed serious liquidity to function.
We see Ferdinand and Isabella implementing national property and sales taxes to fund their government directly.
They had to. But they also looked at the shifting economy and saw that the real wealth was moving. It wasn't just in the agricultural fields anymore, it was in the cities.
The merchants, the traders, the
Right.
bankers.
Yes. This is the strategic alliance that ultimately killed feudalism. The king and the merchant class realized they were natural allies.
Now that seems counterintuitive at first. I would assume merchants would absolutely hate royal taxes. Why would they want a strong central king?
Because they hate chaos, even more than taxes. Imagine you are a merchant in 1400 trying to move a shipment of wool from York to London or wine across France.
Okay.
You were getting stopped every 10 miles by some local lord demanding a toll to cross his bridge. You were dealing with roaming bandits. You were dealing with 50 different local currencies.
It is a complete logistical nightmare.
It completely destroys your profit margins. So the king comes to them and says, I will crush these local lords. I will make the roads safe, and I will standardize the currency across the realm.
And in exchange, the merchants say, we will gladly lend you the money to build the professional army you need to crush those lords.
Exactly. It is almost a protection racket, but a highly formalized, mutually beneficial one.
It is the absolute foundation of the modern national economy. And because of this, we see the rise of these massive superbankers like the Medici in Florence or the Fuggers in Augsburg.
The Fuggers were incredibly important to this era. They essentially bankrolled the Holy Roman Empire and the Spanish crown. They provided the massive loans that paid for the standing armies.
And that totally changes warfare, doesn't it?
Completely. Once a monarch has steady cash, they can hire a professional standing army of mercenaries. They can buy expensive cannons.
You don't need the local knights on horseback anymore because a cannon can knock down their castle walls.
Precisely. The alliance with commercial business definitively broke the military monopoly of the old nobility.
So we have the machinery of government, the control of religion, and the financing all locked down. But looking at the final section of our sources, there is one more piece to this puzzle.
You need a story.
Right. You need a theory that explains why the king gets to do all this in the first place.
The intellectual software update for the state.
Because relying on God said so was getting a little complicated with all the competing religious wars. They needed a secular intellectual justification for this massive power grab.
And for that, we look to Italy first. Niccolo Machiavelli.
The author of The Prince.
Yes, which is often wildly misunderstood as just a handbook for being a villain. But in the context of the new monarchies, Machiavelli was actually arguing for the ultimate stability of the state.
He was a pure pragmatist.
Exactly. He argued that the ruler's primary moral obligation is not to be a nice person, but to preserve the state at all costs. If preserving the state requires fear or deception or crushing a rival, you do it.
Not because you're inherently evil, but because the alternative is anarchy. And anarchy is worse for everyone.
Yes. And it is worth noting he also wrote discourses on Livy, where he emphasized Republican ideals and civic virtue. So he wasn't just anti-freedom. But he recognized that building a stable state in a chaotic world sometimes required ruthless centralized power.
That gave these monarchs the intellectual permission structure to be ruthless. It separated political action from traditional personal morality.
It did. But then you have thinkers like Jean Baudin in France who takes it a step further conceptually. He officially introduces the idea of absolute sovereignty.
Sovereignty is a term we throw around a lot today, but what did it actually mean to Baudin back then?
Baudin argued that for a state to even exist, there must be one single absolute indivisible power.
Indivisible is the key word there.
It is. You cannot share power with the Pope. You cannot share it with a council of nobles. The sovereign has to be the final undisputed word. It became the legal foundation for absolutism.
And once you have these massive sovereign giants, France, Spain, England, all stumbling around on the world stage, they inevitably start bumping into each other.
Which is where Hugo Grotius comes in. He starts looking at the international picture. If there is no Pope to act as the ultimate referee between kings anymore, what are the rules?
Because without rules, they just shoot at each other constantly. So he lays the groundwork for international law.
Exactly. He developed ideas of natural law. The idea that nations interact as sovereign equals on the world stage. It firmly implies that the state is now the main character in history, not the universal church, not a sprawling family dynasty, but the nation.
So let's zoom out and look at the finished product of all this history. We started with a highly fragmented medieval map, and we end up with the literal blueprint for the modern world.
We really do. The new monarchs created the sovereign state as we know it today. They centralized the military, giving the state a monopoly on violence. They centralized the law, They centralized the bureaucracy.
And they created the concept of a national identity, often entirely by force.
That is their lasting legacy. Henry VIII, Isabella Francis I, they were the architects. They took a world that was entirely local and personal and turned it into a world that was national and bureaucratic.
But I want to pause on that force part before we wrap up today, because we have been presenting this largely as progress, order emerging out of chaos. But there is a real darkness to this shift, isn't there?
Absolutely there is. The peace and stability of the nation-state was bought at a very high human price.
The price was liberty.
Yes.
Mm.
Local autonomy was completely crushed. Religious freedom was often obliterated, as we saw with the Inquisition. The Star Chamber, the demands for absolute conformity, these were tools of brutal oppression, just as much as they were tools of order.
It really seems to highlight the eternal tension of politics. To be safe and secure, do we have to surrender our control? The new monarchs emphatically said yes.
They proved that centralization makes a nation powerful, it makes it rich, and it makes it stable. But it also creates a massive impersonal machine that can easily crush the individual.
And as we look at the rise of these absolute states, you can already see the seeds being planted for the massive democratic revolutions that will come a few centuries later, because eventually the people are going to want that power back.
We certainly are. But that is definitely a deep dive for another day.
Indeed it is. It puts our modern debates about the size and power of government into a truly fascinating historical context. Which brings us to a final thought for you to chew on. These monarchs built the modern state by demanding total conformity and stripping away local rights to ensure safety. So we have to ask ourselves, was the birth of the stable nation-state inevitably tied to the rise of coercive central authority? Is the safety of the state always worth the price of absolute control? Something to think about. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We will see you next time.